In the 1960s, Britain began design work on a brand new vehicle for a brand new mission. This light tank would soon expand into an entire family of massively successful armoured vehicles that were laser focused on maximising speed, stealth and simplicity. At a time when tanks were getting bigger, heavier and more complex, Britain decided to go the opposite way. This is the fascinating story of Scorpion, Striker, Spartan, Samaritan, Sultan, Samson and Scimitar, as well as the closely related Sabre, Stormer and Fox. These vehicles dodged defence cuts, helped free the Falklands, dominated the Gulf, then policed the Balkans, before saving countless lives in the Middle East and fending off Russian aggression in Ukraine to this day, all while weighing just 8 tons and being powered by the engine from a Mark II Jaguar. Welcome to CVR-T. But this story begins back in the 1950s, when Britain was running out of soldiers, tanks and time. Post-war Britain had a big problem. Well, it actually had a whole host of problems, and they were all over the globe. Essentially, Britain's grip on her colonies was weakening rapidly, and throughout the 50s there had been a massive uptick in international instances where Britain felt the need to deploy the army. Malaya, Suez, Oman, Jordan, Kuwait, just to name a few. On top of the many existing garrisons in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, Cyprus and Malta, and the requirement for a large British force in Europe to fend off a potential Soviet assault, it was becoming impossible to actually find the troops and, importantly, the tanks to maintain any sort of global strength. But then, an idea. What if, instead of stationing tanks or armoured cars abroad in a semi-permanent manner, you could have one force of armoured vehicles stationed in Britain that could then be rapidly redeployed to wherever they were needed? An armoured vehicle rapid response, like a colonial Thunderbirds. Newer aircraft like the Belfast, Argosy or the upcoming Hercules now had enough cargo space to air transport or even airdrop armoured vehicles. But could a tank small enough to be flown anywhere in the world actually survive on the battlefield? Well, the conflicts were often being fought against insurgents or other relatively lightly armed groups, who very rarely had anti-tank weapons, so thick armour wasn't really required. If they were being flown into significant conflict, they only had to operate as frontline armoured vehicles until heavier reinforcements could arrive by sea. And it's worth noting that even the thickest armour of the time period couldn't adequately protect against heat warheads. That's why the French AMX-30 and German Leopard chose speed over armour after all. As this air mobility requirement progressed, the British were also trying to replace the Saladin armoured car in the armed reconnaissance role, and this small, light armoured fighting vehicle could be a perfect candidate. So in the early 1960s, development started on 2 projects. The first was the lightweight, high-mobility tactical vehicle, LHM-TV, and the second was the heavier Armoured Vehicle Reconnaissance, AVR. LHM-TV was an ambitious project based around the 4.5-ton load limit on the Argosy transport aircraft, attempting to create a 4.5-ton self-propelled gun, APC, 120mm recoilless rifle carrier, an armoured ambulance, and a light recon carrier. However, as you can see, the 4.5-ton limit led to very teeny vehicles, and concerns were raised about how effective they would actually be. AVR, meanwhile, would mount a 76mm or 105mm gun in a 2-man turret, with the driver in front. This fire support weapon would be complemented by a separate compartment at the rear, containing swing-fire anti-tank missiles, and would share the same engine and transmission as the FV432 APC and FV433 Abbott. However, with all these bells and whistles, the vehicle was projected to weigh some 13 tons, far too heavy to be effectively air-portable. It was decided to meet somewhere in the middle and use something like the Hercules as a more sensible carrier. This resulted in the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment building something they called Test Vehicle 15,000, and it was made of aluminium. See, the Americans had started producing the M113 in 1959, which is made almost entirely of an aluminium alloy. This alloy offered the same rough weight per unit area of protection as steel, i.e., it may weigh half as much, but it needs to be twice the thickness, so you're not necessarily saving any weight on armour. However, the far thicker aluminium armour creates sort of a monocoque structure that can support itself, meaning you don't need any cross members, and that's where you can save a lot of weight and provide larger compartments inside the vehicle. TV15000 was unveiled on Christmas Eve 1965 and incorporated hydropneumatic suspension adapted from the torsion bars in FV432. The vehicle was driven from the front, an oddity in British tank design. This is because the engine and transmission both sat at the front as well, with the engine tucked beside the driver for maximum space efficiency and compactness. However, this really limited their engine choices. They had just over 2 meters or 84 inches of width to work with if the future vehicle was going to be able to go into the back of a cargo plane, and considering a driver in winter clothing is about 2 feet or 60 centimeters wide, they were forced to use quite long, narrow engines. Initially, this is a 4-litre 6-cylinder from the Rolls-Royce Van den Plas Princess, but this was later replaced with a 4.2-litre Jaguar XK, a bored-out version of the 3.8-litre in the nippier Jaguar Mark IIs. This 195 horsepower petrol engine powered the 7.5-ton vehicle through a scaled-down version of the Chieftain's transmission, and by 1966 the TV15000, having discarded the heavy and disappointing hydro suspension, was flying around at speeds of 80 km per hour with a representative turret on top. It was around this time that everyone decided that trying to fit a 76mm gun turret and swing-fire ATGMs into one chassis was borderline impossible, so these are split into 2 separate vehicles. And if you're having 2, it makes sense to make it an entire family. At this point, the specifications were also ironed out. Weigh less than 17,500 pounds, be less than 84 inches wide, have a horsepower per tonne of at least 25, and a ground pressure of less than 5 psi. This new vehicle, or vehicles, were to be the CVR-T family, Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance Tracked. This was to differentiate them from the future wheeled CVR-W that would replace Ferret and would emerge as the FV721 Fox. So far, at least, there were 6 different CVR-Ts. The 76mm armed fire support vehicle was to be known as Scorpion, while the swing-fire toting ATGM vehicle was Striker. The new additions were the APC, Spartan, the ambulance, Samaritan, the command post, Sultan, and the recovery vehicle, Samson. The last vehicle was requested slightly later, a close reconnaissance version of Scorpion armed with a 30mm Rarden cannon, the Scimitar. In September 1967, Alvis was awarded a development contract for 30 CVR-T prototypes. 17 of these were to be Scorpions, with the remaining 13 being spread among the other 6 vehicles. The first prototype was delivered 23rd of January 1969 and was somehow on schedule, within budget, and at the specified weight. That's unheard of for any defence procurement. The prototypes were transported across the globe for testing, operating in Australia, Abu Dhabi, Canada and Norway, and following successful tests, the CVR-Ts were accepted for British Army service in May 1970. 2 months later, Alvis was awarded a contract for 275 Scorpions and 288 Scimitars, with delivery starting in January 1972. At the height of production, some 40 vehicles were leaving the production lines a month, with a total of 1,863 CVR-Ts delivered across all types by the time production stopped in 1986. But anyway, what actually were they? How did they differ? And critically, were they any good? First, a word from today's sponsor, Raycon. Newsflash, it's the holiday season, and I've got a perfect gift idea for you. As you know, I've been using the Raycon's Essential Open Earbuds for a few months now, and they're just great. After years of noise-cancelled isolation, I can play my music and hear what's going on around me, and right now, they're up to 20% off for the holidays, so make sure to scoop them up while you can. The Essential Open Earbuds allow you to keep your ears open while delivering crystal clear sound from just outside your ear canal. I've been using them in the gym, on walks, in the kitchen, anywhere really. They're super light, super comfortable, but with the rotating ear hook thing, they actually stay in/on your ear. With 36 hours of battery life and multi-point connectivity, I've no reason to ever take them off. The sound quality is just as good as the more expensive brands, but they are half the price. And if you don't like them, there's a 30-day happiness guarantee. Raycon audio products, including the Essential Open Earbuds, are up to 20% off this season. Just click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/RWFopen to save on Raycon audio products site-wide. Order by December 15th to guarantee delivery by Christmas, because great gifts shouldn't show up late. The FV101 CVR-T Scorpion was the flagship vehicle of the family, so we'll start there. As we've discussed, its mission was armoured reconnaissance in support of other, heavier armoured formations, deploying ahead of a main force to try and find the enemy, as well as engaging enemy forward units to prevent them doing the same. Naturally, the vehicle was also used as flank protection, infantry fire support, counterinsurgency, peacekeeping, and internal security, but recon was still its primary mission. Scorpion's hull was similar to that of the prototype TV15000, with a narrow Jaguar J60 engine at the right, the driver beside it at the left, and the Merritt Wilson 7-speed TN15X transmission at the front linked to the drive wheels. The vehicle rests on 5 aluminium road wheels on each side, each mounted on a transverse trailing torsion bar suspension arm and with dampers on the front and rear set of wheels. There were no return rulers from the 17-inch wide steel tracks. It was a significantly simpler and lighter design than the FV432-esque system used in TV15000, and every CVRT vehicle would use an identical lower hull and drivetrain. At the rear of the hull was the fighting compartment, mounting the fully rotating turret with the commander on the left and the gunner on the right, with the L-23A1 medium velocity 76mm gun between them. This gun could fire HESH, HE, smoke, illuminating and canister, allowing it to be potent against everything but the most armoured threats, or anything far away really. A 7.62mm GPMG was mounted coaxially to the left of the gun. To save weight and cost, the gun controls and turret traverse were all completely manual, which was pretty grim for a vehicle entering service in 1972, but at least the turret itself was relatively light, with the aluminium plates offering protection equivalent to roughly 50mm of rolled steel. Armour is, of course, not exactly a strength of this vehicle, with it only being protected against 50 caliber rounds in the front arc and 7.62mm at the sides and rear. On the outside of Scorpion's turret, you'll see an array of observation equipment, including the L3A1 image intensifier on the turret face, the first production AFV to have passive night vision equipment for driving and gunline. Once the target was spotted, Scorpion had an array of both VHF and HF radios to transmit the target's position and mounted 6 smoke discharges to allow the vehicle to escape if it was spotted itself. It was a great vehicle, if a little underbaked. See, it was rushed into service in January 1972 to evade expected defence cuts which ended up cancelling the Vixen liaison vehicle. As a result of this rush into service, many components had teething issues, especially the night sight and the gearbox, but these were ironed out during its time in service, which we'll get to later. The FV107 Scimitar was almost identical to the Scorpion, except instead of the medium velocity 76mm gun, it mounted a high velocity 30mm cannon. This weapon, the L21A1 Rarden, is capable of firing a 30mm armour-piercing discarding Sabre round at speeds of up to 1,175 meters per second, as well as high explosive incendiary or armour-piercing secondary effect. The drawback is that the Rarden is manually loaded, with the loader slotting 3-round clips into the top of the gun's magazine, which could hold 6 rounds total. This somewhat limited the capability of the Scimitar for rapid sustained fire, but at least the bloke got a good workout in. The next 3 vehicles, FV102 Striker, FV103 Spartan, and FV106 Samson, all look remarkably similar with their raised roof and more angular front, but fulfilled very different roles on the battlefield. The Striker was armed with 10 swing-fire wire-guided anti-tank missiles, with 5 in a hinged bin at the rear of the vehicle and another 5 carried within the vehicle. When a target was sighted, the bin at the rear would elevate to 35 degrees from horizontal, allowing the missiles to fire over the top of the vehicle. The swing-fire missile had a maximum range of about 4 kilometers and was armed with a 7kg heat warhead capable of penetrating up to 800mm of armour. The party trick was a thrust-vectored steering it used, meaning it was able to make 90-degree turns in flight. The idea was that the Striker would be hidden behind a wall or perhaps a big tree. The gunner would dismount along with the guidance system, spot the target, and then guide the missile onto it while the vehicle itself would remain invisible. The guidance system itself was initially a manual command line of sight system, MICLOS, but this was later upgraded to semi-automatic command line of sight, or SACLOS. This meant that instead of manually correcting the flight of the missile with a joystick, the gunner just had to keep his sight on target and a computer would do the rest. Lovely. FV103 Spartan looked similar but was not quite as exciting. It was an armoured personnel carrier. Spartan essentially had a space at the back capable of carrying 4 troops alongside the 3 crew members, with the commander getting a 7.62mm GPMG on a pintle mount on his cupola. Sorry, I know APCs are very important, but there's not much else to say here. They put a bench in it and a big door. FV-106 Samson, meanwhile, was more than just a bench. It was an armoured recovery vehicle, designed to keep the other CVRTs running and upright. At the rear of Samson was a large metal wedge that could be folded down and jammed into the ground, stabilising and securing the vehicle in place. Then an A-frame could be erected, allowing the Samson to be used to remove engines and transmissions and conduct in-field maintenance on other tanks and armoured vehicles. Inside were lots of fun tools and smart blokes who knew how to use them, including a massive winch that could be used to drag other vehicles out of bogs or back onto their tracks. The last two vehicles look, and essentially are, identical, with a much taller roof and a boxy, spacious rear section. The FV-104 Samaritan was the armoured ambulance of the family, with a large rear door and space in the back for casualties. Online sources all say this was either 3 stretcher cases, 8 seated cases, or a combination, with 2 stretchers and 4 seated. However, I can't see any reason why 4 stretchers can't be carried at once. Maybe someone could let me know in the comments. These casualties would add to the existing 2-man crew, 1 driver and 1 medic. The unarmed Samaritan and her brave crew were to drive into frontline areas, pick up and triage casualties, and bring them to a medical centre behind the lines, where they would maybe encounter the last CVRT, the FV-105 Sultan. The Sultan was structurally almost identical to the Samaritan, with a large boxy rear and a big old door at the back. But this was no ambulance, it was a mobile HQ, with a large map board and a desk on one side of the vehicle and a bench at the other. These command and control vehicles and their onboard radio equipment would be used to relay information to friendlies and from friendlies up to a higher command, as well as housing intelligence personnel. Often these would be deployed with a sort of large tent out the back to give officers more space, and 2 Sultans could park back to back to further expand the HQ. And there we have it, the original 7 variants of CVRT that entered service between 1972 and 1978. In 1981, the army reorganised, and each recon regiment had 4 identical squadrons. A headquarters with 2 Sultans, 3 recon troops with 4 Scimitars, a guided weapons troop with 4 Strikers, and a support troop with 4 Spartans. Meanwhile, each of the 13 mechanised infantry battalions received a recon platoon of 8 Scimitars, while each of the 14 armoured regiments each had a recon troop of 8 Scorpions. CVRTs were also deployed in other NATO roles, the UK Mobile Force, the BAOR, the armoured element of the 5th Airborne Brigade, and the Belize Garrison. Less than a year later, in May 1982, the CVRT would get its first taste of combat, when 3 and 4 troop from B Squadron of the Blues and Royals landed on the Falkland Islands to support the assault troops. 3 and 4 troop both consisted of 2 Scorpions, 2 Scimitars and a Samson, and successfully landed with the assault troops on the 21st of May at San Carlos Water. The CVRTs dug in to fend off a potential Argentine counterattack and fired some ambitious 30mm rounds at marauding Argentine jets, with one Scimitar even claiming to have shot down an enemy Skyhawk with its main gun. After the landings were complete and the beachhead secure, the tanks then rapidly advanced cross-country to join the 5th Infantry Brigade in Fitzroy. On the 11th of June, the Scorpions used their 76mm Hesh rounds to support the attack on Mount Longdon, and on the 13th, 3 troops supported the assault by 2 Para on Wireless Ridge, while 4 troop provided fire support to the Scots Guards on Mount Tumbledown. During the Falklands campaign, the 10 CVRTs covered an average of 560 kilometres over difficult terrain, with each Scorpion firing an average of 60 76mm shells, and each Scimitar some 120 30mm rounds. 4 troops leading Scorpion did strike a mine on the 13th, disabling the vehicle with no crew injuries. All 10 vehicles returned to the UK having performed excellently, immediately proving the worth of the CVRT. In 1991, the CVRTs were once again pressed into combat, this time in the vast, empty deserts of Kuwait and Iraq in the Gulf War. In this terrain, the CVRT couldn't exactly flex its reconnaissance abilities. In the desert, a Challenger 1 MBT was far better armed, far better protected, and actually faster than the CVRT, as well as having superior optics and thermal sights. As a result, the CVRTs of the 16th and 5th Royal Lancers were placed under control of the Royal Artillery to provide spotting for the 32nd and 39th Heavy Regiments with their SPGs and MLRSs. By midnight on the 25th of February, the CVRTs had advanced 80 kilometres into Iraq, and at first light on the 26th, the vehicles were conducting reconnaissance on Iraqi positions, when suddenly everything went a bit mental. While A-10 strikes were screeching in and MLRS salvos were landing amongst the Iraqis, all 4 CVRT squadrons were soon involved in direct fire engagements with enemy T-55 tanks, who soon came under accurate, deadly fire from swing-fire missiles fired from the attached FV-102 Strikers, destroying multiple enemy vehicles. It was during this fighting that one Scimitar took a direct hit from a 100mm anti-tank round, which managed to pass straight through the vehicle and out the other side without doing any real damage to the vehicle or the men inside. New underwear was probably required, however. Also serving in the Gulf War was a CVRT variant known as the FV-120 Milan MCT, Milan Compact Turret. This variant of the Spartan entered service in 1986 and mounted twin Milan ATGMs in a compact turret. This provided more mobility to Milan anti-tank teams and saw action with the 3rd Battalion Royal Fusiliers battle group against Iraqi vehicles. Just over a year after they returned victorious from the Gulf, the CVRT went into battle again, deployed as part of the United Nations Protection Force in Bosnia-Herzegovina, escorting aid convoys and providing a buffer between Serbian and Croat forces alongside larger vehicles like Saxon, FV-432 and Warrior. CVRTs would continue to operate in the Balkans, hitting their fair share of mines in the process and suffering their first casualties. The flat-bottomed aluminium vehicles were just not built to shrug off hits from large mines and IEDs. The FV-101 Scorpion did not see any significant service in the Balkans, however. This was because the vehicle was retired in 1994. The reason was the gun, and the toxic fumes it released into the fighting compartment. Yes, testing in the early 1990s revealed that a significant amount of toxic gas filled the turret after firing the 76, which did not have any sort of fume extractor system. The vehicle was very quickly and quietly retired from British service. However, that was not the end for Scorpion. Many of the vehicles were adapted into the Sabre, which mated the old Scorpion hulls with the low-profile turret of the FV-721 Fox, which itself had become mostly obsolete. The Sabre used the same main gun as the Scimitar, and could function as one for all intents and purposes. But neither vehicle will be in service for long, as the UK worked on their replacement, the Tactical Recon Armoured Combat Equipment Requirement, or Tracer. Soon this merged into the American Future Scout and Cavalry System, or FSCS, in an attempt to replace Sabre, Scimitar, and the Bradley with one joint vehicle, the Armoured Scout and Reconnaissance Vehicle, or ASRV. To allow the CVRTs to continue serving while Tracer progressed, the British started a life extension program, LEP, in 1995. This was a three-pronged approach to keep CVRT relevant into the 21st century. First, all Jaguar petrol engines were replaced with a more fuel-efficient Cummins 5.9-litre diesel engine and an upgraded TN15E transmission. Second was the installation of secure radio equipment and a much more advanced thermal sight that could be used on the move. Lastly, other onboard equipment was upgraded, including a new 30mm APDS round, the fitting of a GPS, and new electronics. Of course, like almost all joint procurement projects do, Tracer soon collapsed, and the CVRT was forced to fight on, seeing combat in Iraq and Afghanistan into the 2010s. Sabre was phased out in 2004, while Striker made it to 2005, before the Javelin made it largely obsolete. Spartan began to be replaced with the Panther in 2009. A new CVRT would be used in Afghanistan, the Scimitar 2. This vehicle was an attempt to make the Scimitar more capable at taking a hit from a mine, and essentially plopped a Scimitar turret on top of a Spartan hull. This extra space allowed the crew to be suspended from the top of the vehicle rather than bolted to the bottom, making the Scimitar 2 a lot more survivable when hitting a mine or an IED. In Iraq, the CVRTs operated with another vehicle, the Stormer HVM. Stormer was essentially a larger, modernised CVRT with an extra road wheel on each side. One variant is a simple flatbed, the HMLC, used for transporting supplies or laying minefields. The Stormer HVM, meanwhile, mounts 8 Starstreak surface-to-air missiles for force protection. The Stormer can also be equipped with the Martlet or the lightweight modular missile. The MOD finally began to retire Scimitar in 2023, replacing it with the troubled Ajax. However, that was just the end of British service. Many CVRTs have served and continue to serve in various militaries around the globe, many of whom have upgraded the little tanks to stay relevant and stay deadly into present day. Some have been upgraded with brand new armour packages, 90mm guns, Spike ATGMs, you name it. Iran also designed a brand new light tank in 1997, which may or may not be an exact copy of CVRT, some of which they had previously used in the Iran-Iraq War. Scorpion turrets keep appearing on many other vehicles, like the Aussie M113 MRV or the Canadian AVGP Cougar, and despite many nations retiring the vehicles, often they were straight back into combat, with Ukraine operating a large number of CVRTs in their ongoing fight against Russian invasion. These are mainly ex-UK and ex-Latvian Scorpions, Scimitars and Spartans. Anyway folks, I hope this has given you an insight into what I think is probably the most successful British vehicle since the Centurion. Delivered on time, on spec and on budget, and serving for some 50 years in every major conflict Britain has been involved in. Universally loved by their crews, and extremely successful in the export market, it could even be Britain's most successful armoured vehicle of all time. What do you think? CVRT supremacy or an aluminium death trap? Let me know down below. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please do leave a like if so, and subscribe for more content like this. If you really enjoyed, could I ask if you can consider supporting the channel on Patreon like these lovely people already do? If not, I'll see you next time, and of course, Slava Ukraini.